Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. All right. Okay, so they introduced me, but before I get into anything, can you hear me okay? Is this my, good? Okay. Before I get into anything, I really just want to start with thank you. Thank you for having me here, for choosing me to be here. Thank you for coming. Thank you for caring. I've given a few speeches before about my story, but none of them have ever been to a room of social workers. So this is a completely whole new level of important and exciting for me. So thank you. Two, I recognize that in some ways I am coming from a position of privilege. And I don't mean through telling my story to imply that I think everything available to me throughout my lifetime has been available to everyone else. I don't. I'm going to be sharing my story, which means two things to me. One, this isn't a prescription or a recipe for how to live your life. And it also means that no one can say to me it didn't happen that way, or that it didn't feel like that. And lastly, discomfort. I'm going to be talking about bodies and sizes and things that make some people really uncomfortable. And I'm certainly going to be feeling that up here. So I want to invite everyone into that space with me. And that's not for all of us to be comfortable, that's for all of us to be uncomfortable together. I think that is largely what we're here for. Okay, so how losing 150 pounds taught me about mental health. Well, before my weight loss, I didn't believe in mental health. I was skeptical about all things related to mental health. I didn't believe in addictions or disorders or coping skills or therapy. I believed in having willpower and being in control of your emotions and getting a grip and moving on and being strong. Before I lost weight, I thought that health was physical health, but I only learned through my weight loss that if you focus only on physical health, you are missing other really important parts of the human puzzle. And that the only way I could maintain a physical transformation was by switching up my priorities and focusing on my mental, emotional, psychological, spiritual, social health. So today, is this something? Okay. Today, I like to use the definition of the word freedom to define what mental health means to me. And that is the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. And I say that because I mean restraint from society in general. I mean restraint and restriction from other people. And I also mean restraint and restriction from yourself. So before I get into me, I want to ask you all to think about a question. I, unlike the other presenters, will not ask for your answers, but I do want you to sit and think about it. Close your eyes if that makes you more comfortable. But think about what makes you aware of your size. Now I have a follow-up question. When does it hurt? Now, if you're thinking of something, nod your head for me, if you could. Okay, so from where I'm standing, everyone knows what this feels like. Okay. So, in my experience, I like to say that as soon as I could feed myself, I was eating too much. I have no memories growing up as a kid not being morbidly obese. So everything made me aware of my size. These pictures are all from high school. Everything made me aware of my size. So it wasn't just shopping for clothes or shoes, it was also getting on an airplane, or getting in a car, or sitting in a desk in class, or a seat in a movie theater, or a booth in a restaurant. It was also apple-shaped bodies and pear-shaped bodies in magazines, because I remember seeing those growing up and feeling immediately different, excluded from the mainstream. The message that I got was, these are what bodies look like, and this is what you look like. And these things were necessarily not designed for me. Now, I learned early on that society wasn't really creating a space for a body like mine to exist. And because I literally didn't fit in, I never had the privilege of not being aware of my size. The thing about growing up obese for me was that it became the lens through which I saw the world. And does anyone remember the website Formspring? Yeah. Okay, that's the reaction I'm looking for. So this website was, you make a page and anyone can write on it anonymously. And after too many teen suicides, it was taken off the internet. But I remember when it came to my high school, and everyone was making one, so I had this kind of back and forth conversation with myself, like, I think I'm gonna make one. I think it'll be fine, like, I have a lot of friends, people are nice to me. You cannot make one of these. No, I think it'll be fine, like, I have friends and I'm really not bullied, like, people are nice. You cannot make one of these. So I made one, naturally. And I remember the first 3 comments I got were, you are the funniest girl in our grade, you are friends with everyone, you have a nice smile. And I remember thinking, see? Like, I knew it. And then the last comment before I deleted the page was, how much do you eat in one setting? And I remember thinking 2 things. 1, it's sitting. And 2, I knew it. I felt like I did it to myself. And looking back now, the biggest problem is not that I didn't know better. The problem is that I thought I should have. The problem is not that I thought I deserved it, because I didn't. The problem is that I knew, at the very least, to always be expecting it. And that's what existing in the world felt like. You're always asking for it. But I was what some people refer to as the skinny girl in a fat suit. Because just like I deleted my Formspring page and never in my life told that story, I was in complete denial about my obesity. And so with the exception of rare moments like this, I just pretended it didn't exist at all. So I was the class clown. I was the life of the party. I was popular at school. I was confident in myself. And I saw through my childhood how shocking that was to so many people when I said that I was the captain of my softball team or in the musicals dancing on stage. And I remember seeing the look of shock and surprise. And eventually, after so many of those microaggressions, thinking, well, what is so wrong with me being happy? And why does it bother you so much that I don't hate myself? And eventually even realizing the words that we use around obesity, because I remember thinking, who the hell are you to tell me that I'm suffering with obesity? What if I'm just obese? And I learned that I was going through life in a world not only designed for people who did not look like me, but also expected less from those who did. So not everyone has the opportunity to go from an oppressed to a privileged social identity. It's not every day you're going from female to male, or racial minority to majority, or poor to rich, disabled to able. But I did go from obese to thin in a year. So I like to share what I learned about the society that we are all living in, because I truly had no idea. I thought my clothes would be smaller and every other part of my life was to stay the same. And that speaks, I think, to how in denial I really was. So I'm going to get into my story, but this really isn't about me. I represent what I think is a problem dangerously mistreated and dangerously misunderstood and affecting millions of people. I'm not saying everyone who's overweight or has ever struggled with food has the same story or experience that I have. I know that that's not true. But this does touch on a lot of our population, and we'll get there. So my weight gain began with trauma that caused pain, for which I needed numbing and comfort that I found in food. And though I adamantly refused to accept this with my therapist growing up, that I was forced to see, I used food like a drug as a coping mechanism growing up. Now, I promise to not get too scientific about this, but just hear me out. When we eat food, our brain releases the neurotransmitters dopamine and serotonin. These two chemicals, combined with oxytocin and endorphins, are what chemists refer to as the happiness cocktail, because it activates what's called the mesolimbic or reward center in our brain. So because as human beings we survive on food, we are biologically designed to not only feel happy and rewarded when we eat it, but also to seek out a source of serotonin when our cortisol, or stress hormone, is too high. So just like the other addictions in the DSM, drugs, alcohol, gambling, and most recently internet gaming disorder, food for some people works the exact same way, because it's all about activating the reward. So the ACE study, I think every single social worker needs to know about the ACE study, proved this a little bit more. It was the only one of its kind at the time, surveyed 17,000 adults recruited between 1995 and 1997, and studied the correlation between ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, anything from a parent dying, a parent being imprisoned, mental illness, abuse, neglect, etc., and the struggles that these individuals had later in life. And what they found significantly across the board is that as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk of the following, including a whole long list of issues later on, but I'm going to focus on alcohol, drugs, etc., smoking. Because this was groundbreaking in the field of drugs and in addiction, because it started to answer the question, why is it that most people who try most drugs are not addicted to them? And what it proved is that we have to stop questioning and doubting the willpower of this adult and look at where they came from and what was happening in their immediate environment while their brain was neurobiologically developing to handle stress. And it was groundbreaking for me personally, because if you do a little bit more research and look into the selected journal publications that aren't on here, what you see is that obesity works the same way. And it started to make sense of everything for me, because it wasn't a willpower problem every time that I was brought to another dietitian or nutritionist or back to Weight Watchers yet again. It wasn't that I had no willpower. It's that there was death and loss and trauma and mental illness and depression and grieving in my immediate environment. And that when I was 5 years old, my two primary caregivers were mourning the loss of a child. It's not that I had no willpower. But like me, most 5-year-olds have never experienced the effect of a cigarette, or a shot, or a line, or a bump, or a hit. But they do have to eat every day. So, like I've heard in terms of restorative justice, don't ask what's wrong with them. Ask what happened to them. Now, my weight loss began when I moved out of my home and away to college and was happy, safe, supported in a foreign environment. And so the summer before my sophomore year at the University of Michigan, go blue, I felt like I have 4 months to lose as much weight as I possibly can. And I know how to do this, eat less, exercise more. I've been told that my whole life. But then by the time September rolled around, I had lost like 40 or 50 pounds already. And I was really starting to feel it and see it. And I was invested in my weight loss in a way that I had never been before. So because at this point, instead of only having one big problem in my life, I was solving the one big problem in my life. Instead of always being wrong, I was always right. So instead of being bad and deviant, I was finally good and almost normal. So where there was once shame and fear, it had now been replaced with praise and joy. And every single interaction that I had, be it with other people, friends, acquaintances, strangers on the street, clothing, the mirror, or even just typing on my computer and seeing bones and veins in my own hands, every single interaction became reward. So when I say that I was invested in it, what I mean is that I became addicted to it. This is the first week of May 2012 to the first week of May 2013. So that's what an addiction to dieting looks like after 1 year. But I didn't know anything at the time other than the golden rule, which to me was eat less, exercise more. So my eating less became eating too little, and my exercising more became exercising too much, to the point where my hair was falling out and I was freezing all the time, everywhere. I was dizzy and nauseous and fatigued, and there were black spots everywhere when I stood up. So I went to a few different doctors, my pediatrician, my parents' doctor, an endocrinologist, and an OBGYN, and all of them told me the same thing. Well, you lost a lot of weight really fast. With maintenance, these symptoms will subside. They saw my body, and they saw my blood work, and they said, congratulations, this is the healthiest you've ever been. So not long after that, I was on the phone with a nutritionist because I hit a plateau, and for 2 weeks I couldn't lose any weight. So she was the first person to say to me, are you still getting your period? And I was like, no, that's so funny that you asked though, because last week was the first one that I ever missed in my whole life. And she said, yeah, you've hit a starvation mode and you need to stop for now. And I was like, I have 10 pounds left to lose. What do you mean? But she explained to me, these are symptoms of daily starvation, not sickness. And you need to eat more, exercise less. So while we're here, 7% of registered physicians are trained in nutrition, and most of them still think calories in, calories out is the way to lose weight. So these instructions to eat more and exercise less were coming to me at a point in time where if I were sitting in traffic on the way to work, I would count how many minutes I was in the car, which was how many minutes I wasn't on the Stairmaster, which was how many calories I wouldn't burn, which was what food I wasn't allowed to eat later in the day to make up for it. And it really didn't matter what kind of classes I was in or meetings I was in or conversations I was pretending to have, because that evil little math equation was just playing on a loop the rest of the day. So every second of every day became a battle between eat less, exercise more, and eat more, exercise less. Go to the gym, don't go to the gym. Eat this, don't eat this. So by the time it was September again, I called my mom from school, now in that point of my transformation, to tell her, this is the least I've ever weighed and the least happy I've ever been. Because 3 things were happening. 1, after weight loss, I realized that my entire life revolved around maintaining it. And I felt more defined and controlled by my body at my thinnest than I ever had in my life. And I desperately wanted my life back. I wanted freedom. Second, I was endlessly dissatisfied. And I realized that I had cultivated a consciousness of my body at a time when it was a work in progress. So now every time I looked at it, it was a problem to solve. A lot of things that needed to be fixed. And I started to think, well, if I could do this much and transform this dramatically and get so much praise and still not be happy, something is really wrong here. And lastly, it was the first time in my life that I wasn't using food, eating it, or food restricting it to cope with my emotions. So instead of being strong, I was feeling everything all the time. My therapist likes to say that the floodgates were opened. And at 20 years old, I was learning how to feel sadness, frustration, anxiety, fear, helplessness for the first time in my life. And what I observed was that actually feeling things, not numbing them, meant that I was becoming a moody, anxious, unpredictable, out of control, emotional person that I had no experience being before. And much to my surprise and much to my disappointment, life was so much harder on this side of things because my weight loss left me an open wound. And so every time I cried at yet another commercial or another news article or a wedding or whatever, I was crying at everything. I missed, ironically, how much easier life was when I was protected and how much better everything felt when nothing could hurt me. And I started to think about, well, how was it that I used to be this really happy, outgoing, loud, spontaneous person? Where did she go? And what I realized was, I don't know that I was happy. I know that I denied feeling sadness. And maybe I was carefree and laid back because I didn't admit fear or anxiety or helplessness. And I was everyone's friend, but as a defense mechanism. And the highly revered personality that I had growing up was much more a persona than it was me as a person. So on a micro level, things got pretty tough, but on a macro level, I couldn't believe how easy it was. I never knew thin privilege, so I didn't know what I was getting into, but now I could sit anywhere I wanted, any desk, any chair, any seat, any booth, anything. I could get on an airplane or into a car and not worry about the seatbelt. And I could wear hair ties on my wrist, finally, without getting my circulation cut off. And it felt like I could wear whatever I wanted, I could eat whatever I wanted, I could go wherever, I could do whatever I wanted. Or so it felt. Because even the things that my body never stopped me from doing, now I could do them without pissing people off. And I could do them without making people feel uncomfortable. I could be me, but with freedom. I was still shocking people though. When I said that I was studying at NYU, now I heard things like, oh, so you're like actually smart? But it was even more than that, because I started to feel like my entire life was being built upon skinny privilege. So for example, I was working behind the desk at one job, I will not disclose where that was, when a girl came in and handed me her resume because she wanted a job there too. So I gave it to my manager, a guy, who looked directly past me to the other guy I was working with and said, well, was she cute? And he was like, I don't know. So my manager said, well, was she above a 6? And he said, no. So my manager crumpled up her resume and threw it in the trash and said, no one below a 6 is going to work behind the desk here. And at the same time, I was working as a personal trainer in a corporate gym and realizing that in terms of my job, in terms of my income, my body meant credibility, stability, and that as a human being, my body was social capital, and that my fear of gaining weight was now compounded by a fear of losing privilege. 2, intersectionality. So I was a bartender for 3 nights of my life, literally. And the first night I was there, the manager said to me, you never tell anyone that you have a boyfriend. And it felt at the time like a microcosm of the world, because I felt immediately sexualized fairly overwhelmingly often in situations where I would have never had a role before, and 2, I still couldn't believe I was even visible. And I started to consider that I didn't just lose 150 pounds, I divided my body in half as a 21-year-old female. And I don't know, had I been male, that I would have felt so vulnerable and exposed and violated, even manipulated because of my gender. And 3, cultural relativism. I studied abroad at this time, and I was in different countries, on different continents, seeing firsthand that beauty and size and body ideals are necessarily dependent on culture, and that one body in one place is not even close to the ideal in another place, and that the body I wanted so bad and destroyed my health for was one that people from other countries would look at me and just say, why? And I realized that it made me happy to fit in, but only because I was blending into the world outside my own head. And that I really didn't care how big the seats were or how small the clothes were. I was just happy that I could now fit into them. But we have to consider the cultural context that we are in now, where it seems this preoccupation with how the physical looks is deeper than how the emotional feels. So I have a lot of clients that come to me and say now, you know, my biggest problem with food is that I'm an emotional eater. And my response to that is, that's not a problem that you have with food. That's a question about how you're coping with your emotions. But, number 1, the prevalence of the mental health stigma, we know this exists around us, which means that we are living and working amongst this collective tendency to suppress, deny, reject, avoid, numb feeling and pain. But I argue that if we actually felt our pain, we would see a lot fewer weight issues. 2, the belief and trust in weight loss programs, diet, meal plan programs, all of it, is only perpetuating this problem. And I know that it sounds ironic, but again, hear me out. The only way for weight loss to be permanent is if the means through which you achieve it are sustainable. So it's not that you can't count points or that it won't work. You can and it will temporarily. You just have to ask yourself how you plan to maintain the weight you lost through counting points when you no longer want to count points. So if I go back to this same program 3, 4, 5 times because it worked in the past, is it really working? Or is it designed for you to fail? And if I cannot sustain, succeed, or survive without it, am I reliant, dependent, addicted to it? Am I free? Lastly, are these, for some people, the birthplace of an eating disorder or a lifelong addiction? I think so. 3, attention paid to transformations in the media. If we look at what is sensationalized about weight loss in the media, you see things like The Biggest Loser, or half their size issues on the cover of glossy magazines, or an ad to lose 10 pounds by yesterday. And the priority is rapid and extreme weight loss, not healthy, sustainable weight loss, which is kind of funny to me, because the real question is not how do we lose weight? The question is how do we lose weight forever? And I just want to bring an awareness to the fact that we're not exposed to coverage of weight maintenance the way we are weight loss. And just in case anyone happened to be wondering why that might be true, it's because, 1, they are not maintaining it. The New York Times did a really good article a couple of years ago about the biggest losers who gain it all back. And 2, if they are maintaining it, it's by staying on the diet, exercise, lifestyle that created the weight loss in the first place. So the National Weight Control Registry actually looks at and surveys people who have kept weight off. And a lot of these people have a few things in common. As per their website, they have a low-calorie diet, a low-fat diet, they exercise daily, and weigh themselves often. It's not that diets don't work, it's that diets can't end. Onward. 4, the power of the healthcare, medical, pharmaceutical, insurance industries. They are called industries for a reason, and these specifically are the ones that profit directly off of illness, disease, obesity. So there's a really interesting phenomenon called addiction transfer that it's pretty much what I did. When an addict gives up one addiction for another, I give up food for dieting. But if you type addiction transfer into Google, the first 2 things that come up are after bariatric surgery and after gastric bypass, which for anyone who doesn't know, these are weight loss procedures. So it's not that there's a complete lack of awareness of how this works, why so many people get these surgeries and begin smoking or drinking or shopping or some other addictive behavior. But from a business standpoint, it makes much more sense for me to profit off of your surgery than it does for me to fund you going to therapy. Lastly, the food industry is profiting off of addiction, while the diet industry is profiting off of making you feel like a failure. And consumerism combined with capitalism within a patriarchal society profits off of insecurity. And this is a problem. More than a third of US adults are obese. Some numbers are saying up to 41%. Obesity-related conditions include heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and certain types of cancer, some of the leading causes of preventable death. I'm going to say that again. The leading causes of preventable death. This is a social justice issue. Lastly, $147 billion a year, and that was 10 years ago. So, how can we solve this problem? A client of size walks into your office. We have to ask ourselves, what are my initial thoughts? What kinds of things do I think I already know? How does the way that I see them differ from how I see another client? And how does the way I see them influence the way that I'm treating them? And are my definitions of good, better, healthy a product of the fat-phobic environment that raised me? And ultimately, can I work with this population? Because if we don't address our own biases, we become the problem. Because how people are being treated, especially by other health professionals because of their weight, is a much bigger problem than their weight. So where other professionals are going to assume and jump to conclusions and ignore and mistreat their clients, it's literally our job to see beyond what they look like and into who they are as human beings. So, for example, I had a client at the gym. He's between 300 and 400 pounds, and he was seeing a dietitian at the time who instructed him to eat 1,200 calories a day, which, by the way, is inhumane and happening all over the place. Yeah. But when he came to me as a personal trainer in the gym, I would have him crying on the gym floor because I was asking him things like, when did your weight gain begin? And he, a man who works for the fire department, said right after 9/11, when 6 of his friends passed away. I had another client this year at my internship whose girlfriend was pressuring him into getting a consultation for weight loss surgery because he lost 130 pounds and gained it all back plus some, which, by the way, is what happens to between 95 and 98% of people who lose weight on a diet. That's another speech for another day. But when he showed me a picture of himself 130 pounds lighter, I said to him, how does it feel having all this weight back on your body? And he was like, I'm tired and lethargic and angry. And I said, what might be some of the good things about having this weight on your body? And he said, well, I realized he switched immediately from I statements to you statements and said, people really don't mess with you as much. And I said, okay, so safety, comfort, protection? And he said, yeah, and I actually have a lot of those issues too. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, with being adopted and everything. I said, okay, so I'm not going to tell you what to do, self-determination, but I'm just going to ask you a question. Do you think you can solve an emotional problem with a physical solution? And he said, I never thought of it that way. Most of our clients, most people are not thinking of it that way. It is our job to think of it that way. So, how we can help. 1, alternative methods of coping and stress reduction and healing. We need to help our clients figure out, well, how else can I get that reward? How else can I get that serotonin? How do I bring my cortisol stress down? That's what we can help with. Because for me personally, I use things like journaling and meditating and therapy and yoga, not dieting and exercising to maintain my weight loss. Because I realize that if I feel and process my emotions, I don't eat them. 2, meet them where they are. So when I was on the phone with my therapist in July of 2013, because I was finding it frustratingly impossible to eat a little bit more and exercise a little bit less, she said to me, well, are you happy? And I said, well, yeah, but I want to be like carefree happy again, not control-free happy. So she asked me a lot of questions about my lifestyle and what my day-to-day looked like at that point. And she said to me, okay, so you're still allowed to eat your salad with grilled chicken and no dressing, but do you think that you could do it in a restaurant and not in your apartment? And you're still allowed to run 5 miles every day, but do you think that just for a few days a week you could start by not tracking it? And even though the mere suggestion filled me with anxiety and fear, she knew where I was and how far of a step I would be willing to take. And had she not known how to meet me where I was, I don't know if or how or when I would have gotten out. And lastly, educate them. The only person in my life including and especially doctors, to ever suggest to me that my body was a symptom, not a problem, was my social worker. And she taught me how food was numbing and dieting was distracting, so that on the days where I felt I couldn't eat more than 500 calories a day, I knew better. I knew to recognize it as a coping mechanism and consider the things that I wasn't feeling or the things I was trying not to think about. So, for example, 2 months ago, it was the first week of this semester when my dad had just come home from the hospital, and we knew only that he had days left to live. And I found myself one of those mornings in the same mirror, under the same lighting, in the same place that I always do. But this time, I hated everything I saw. I was only fat and cellulite and stretch marks and all the things that I was taught to hate. And I was so angry and so upset. And as I was texting my boyfriend, this is the worst workout I've ever had in my entire life, it occurred to me, well, why might this be happening now, here, like this, so intensely? And I realized immediately and was in tears instantly because I knew I'm critiquing something I can control, because it's so much easier than accepting the pain that I can. It's not our job to eliminate or minimize the pain of a client, but we can teach them how to process it, educate them on how coping works, and bring an awareness to their instincts. Lastly, it's up to us. Other health professionals are doing it wrong. We live in a world that is profiting off of making millions of people feel like a failure to solve an emotional problem with a physical solution. But it's our job. We are therapists to get to the root cause. So I recently found myself speaking to an addiction specialist after an opioid epidemic panel at my agency. So I went to him and I said, I just want to make sure that everything that I'm learning about food and addiction and obesity, dopamine, the ACE study, all this stuff is true. And he said, yeah, it's absolutely true. You totally get it. And I said, okay, well, you're a PhD and I'm a first year student and I really don't know that much yet, but am I right to conclude that people really aren't talking about this? Like, we have all this data, it's proven. Why isn't anyone acting like it? And he said, no, you're totally right. He said, there's a lack of funding, there's a lack of interest, and there's no sense of urgency because people aren't dropping dead from obesity the way they are a heroin overdose. So I said to him, listen, I get it, I hear you, but remember my name, because if I have anything to do with it, that is going to change. Thank you.